Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
The thing about my mother is that she doesn't scream, she doesn't curse, and she certainly doesn't throw anything. No, she doesn't need to, because her specialty has always been cutting people apart with a knife so small and so polished that you barely notice the blood until long after you've left the room. And the wound looks clean until the infection sets in weeks or years later during a conversation you can't remember why you started in the first place. Sunday dinners were her theater. The same roast chicken she never actually seasoned, the same lemon pie she baked mostly because Melanie's husband loved it, and the same round of subtle humiliation she served up like dessert, only it was always for me, and everyone else just pretended not to see it. She laid the table like a magazine spread, and then, like clockwork, she'd find something in my life to smile through while twisting the knife. An ex-boyfriend, a missed promotion, a haircut that maybe framed your face a little too sharply, or a just curious question like, still renting that tiny apartment above the yoga place? As if it wasn't her who once told me not to settle down too quickly, to build my own life, and then mocked the result when I did exactly that. Melanie, of course, sat across from me looking angelic as ever. Her hair always pulled back in one of those effortless buns that probably took her 45 minutes and 3 YouTube tutorials to get right, laughing politely, brushing off compliments like she was embarrassed by them, even though we both knew she collected them like trophies. Mom called her my little homemaker, as if raising 2 kids and organizing birthday parties with color-coded themes made her the heir to the family's emotional estate, while I, apparently, had opted for some kind of feral exile, working somewhere in marketing and being, God forbid, single and childless at 36. That night wasn't different, not really, except something in the air felt heavier, maybe because I had barely slept the night before, or maybe because Melanie had casually mentioned, between bites of overcooked green beans, that she and Craig were buying a lake house. A modest one, she said, like the word would make me forget that I was struggling to cover both rent and car insurance after a rough quarter at work. Mom clapped her hands together like a debutante at a cotillion and said, "I always knew you'd make it, sweetheart. You were just born with that spark." And then she turned to me. I felt it coming. I always did. "Lena, do you remember when you wanted to open that cafe? What was it called, Bitter Bean?" she asked, tilting her head in that way that made it sound like genuine curiosity, even though we both knew it was mockery. "Bitterroot," I said, my voice flat. She smiled and nodded. "Right, that's the one. I remember your father and I sat down and said, well, she always tries hard, even if her ideas are different." And that was it. No raised voices, no slamming fists, just another incision. Melanie winced, but she didn't say anything. She never does. That's her trick, pretending to be Switzerland while benefiting from the war. I stared at the wine glass in front of me, my fingers running around the rim slowly, and I thought about all the times I'd stayed quiet to avoid exactly this scene, all the hours I'd spent analyzing every comment afterward, wondering if I was overreacting, if I was too sensitive, if maybe I had failed too many times, and maybe Mom was just being honest. But this time, something inside me didn't move to defend her, or myself. Something inside me just shut off. So I stood up, slowly. I didn't say anything, didn't make a scene, didn't even take my jacket off the chair. I just walked out the front door, leaving my mother mid-sentence and Melanie calling after me like she hadn't just sat there and let it happen for the 1,000th time. I drove home in silence, no music, no tears, just the hum of the highway, and the feeling that I had finally crossed some invisible line I didn't even know I had been standing on for years. The air outside felt colder, sharper, and every light I passed looked somehow unfamiliar, like the world had tilted just slightly, as if it had been waiting for me to get up from that chair all along. I didn't expect anything after that. I didn't expect apologies or reflection. I didn't even expect a follow-up. But the next morning, as I poured myself a coffee and stared blankly at the dull gray sky outside my kitchen window, my phone buzzed with a message from Melanie. "I don't know what you said, but Mom just broke down." And just like that, I realized I might have left the dinner table, But something real, had stayed behind in that room. Something that finally cracked her. And I hadn't even said a word. When I woke up the next morning, the kind of morning where the sunlight doesn't pour through the blinds, but rather limps in like it's just as tired as you are, I had already decided not to check my phone, not because I was expecting anything, but because that Sunday dinner had left a bitter residue in the back of my throat. A kind of psychic hangover that no amount of caffeine or silence could shake. And I wasn't ready to see the world yet, not even through a screen. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost with unfinished business, letting the coffee brew longer than necessary, ignoring the pile of unopened mail on the counter, the stack of dishes in the sink I promised myself I'd take care of the night before, and the half-written to-do list I'd scribbled on the back of a grocery receipt, hoping that some version of me, perhaps one more hopeful or more naive, might pick it up again and feel inspired. But my hand drifted toward my phone anyway, as it always does, like muscle memory can override whatever boundaries your mind tries to set for itself. There it was, one notification, a message from Melanie, the last person I expected, or wanted, to hear from so soon. My thumb hovered for a second longer than necessary, because even though the rational part of me knew she'd probably text something bland like, "Hope you got home safe," there was another part, a part that still believed in surprise, that knew this family had a way of erupting at the strangest, quietest moments. The message was short, but it landed like a slap across the face, cold, immediate, and impossible to ignore. "I don't know what you said, but Mom just broke down." I stared at those words for what felt like forever, rereading them without fully digesting what they meant. Because how do you process a sentence like that when you didn't say anything? How does silence, pure, intentional, surgical silence, have the power to dismantle a woman who has spent decades building emotional armor out of passive remarks, guilt-laced praise, and the unspoken demand for compliance? I didn't respond right away. I let the phone fall to the couch beside me, screen still glowing, while my mind drifted through the maze of yesterdays I never fully escaped. Childhood memories surfaced without permission, the way Melanie used to steal my markers and Mom would say, "Well, she's younger, be patient with her," or the time I got a perfect score on my science fair project and she said, "You must have had help, that's too neat to be yours." She never yelled. She didn't have to. Her words lived longer than shouting ever could. They clung to walls, got into your clothes, into your hair like cigarette smoke in a cheap motel. No matter how many showers you take, they linger. I remembered once, I must have been 10, sitting in the back seat of the car on a grocery run, when I asked if we could stop for ice cream, and she laughed. Not in the haha that's funny way, but in the way you laugh when someone says something pathetic and you want them to know it. And she said, "You always want treats you don't earn." That was it, no further explanation. Just that one-liner, etched into my ribcage, like an old carving in a school desk no one ever sanded down. So no, I didn't feel guilt. I felt something else, something much quieter. The same thing I imagine a person feels when they finally stop treading water and let themselves sink. Not out of surrender, but because floating had become too exhausting to maintain. I didn't even bother pretending I was confused by the message. I knew that my silence had landed differently this time, not as compliance, not as defeat, but as refusal. I had refused to dance, to participate, to offer up my usual defenses so she could knock them down and feel superior afterward. I had walked out, and in doing so, I had forced her to confront the empty air that replaced my presence. Eventually, I typed back a reply. One I knew would irritate, unsettle, maybe even hurt. But I sent it anyway, because I wasn't interested in damage control anymore. I didn't say anything. Maybe that's the problem. Less than a minute later, the 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then came back again. I imagined Melanie standing in her kitchen, one of the twins tugging on her sweater, Craig probably asking where the sippy cups were, and her holding her phone like it was a grenade she wasn't sure how to throw. When her reply finally came, it wasn't what I expected. "Did you tell her about Dad?" I sat up straighter, heart suddenly doing that uneven stutter step thing it does. when the past you've locked away in a back room comes bursting through the door like it never left. I didn't respond, not right away, because that name, that topic, wasn't supposed to be touched. My father had been the only buffer between me and Mom for a long time, the only one who saw me without the filter of comparison or contempt. And when he died, it was like someone knocked out the support beam, holding up the rest of the house. But there had been something I never told anyone. Something I barely let myself revisit because it felt too fragile, too dangerous, too easily dismissed. A week before he died, when the hospital was still letting us sneak in, little bits of reality between oxygen tubes and whispered reassurances, he pulled me aside. He looked smaller, like time had folded him in, and his voice was dry and brittle like autumn leaves. "You know we'll turn to dust if you touch them the wrong way." And he said, "Your mom, she means well, but she's better at stories than truth. Don't let her rewrite yours." I never told anyone those words. I held on to them like a secret life vest, something I could cling to on the nights when I wondered if I was just imagining all of it, if maybe I really was too dramatic or too cold or too difficult to love. And now, here was Melanie, asking if I'd shared that with Mom. I hadn't, not yet. But maybe it was time. I didn't answer her. Instead, I scrolled back through old messages, saw the patterns, the casual dismissals, the sweet nothings that always came wrapped in conditions. And then I opened a new text, to Mom, and I typed, "Do you remember what Dad told me the week he died?" I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't need one, because I already knew the silence was doing exactly what words never could. The first time I realized that my mother was capable of convincing the world that something untrue was gospel truth. I was 12 years old and standing in the school counselor's office with a paper in my hand that said I'd been exhibiting signs of social withdrawal, poor emotional regulation, and possible oppositional behavior, which, according to the formal smile on Mrs. Halberd's face, meant I might need to see someone outside of school. And while I couldn't process much of what that meant at the time, what I did know, what I felt in my bones with a kind of clarity that children rarely possess, was that my mother had not just suggested this evaluation, she had authored it. She had a way of planting things into official channels that made it look like she was being a responsible parent, concerned, attentive, proactive, when in reality what she was doing was reshaping the narrative to reflect the version of me that she preferred to believe existed. A version that needed fixing, that needed guidance, that would forever remain in debt to her vigilance. Melanie never had any such interventions. Melanie was bright, bubbly, normal. She got into trouble, yes. Snuck out to a party in 9th grade, kissed a boy behind the community center during youth group. But her missteps were seen as phases, growing pains, the adorable rebelliousness of a golden child. Mine were pathologies. Mine were treated like malfunctions in the wiring. I thought about that as I sat on my bedroom floor, cross-legged with a half-finished glass of wine sweating onto the hardwood beside me, surrounded by boxes I hadn't opened in years. Some left over from my last apartment, some shoved in the back of my closet, the kind you move from place to place without ever unpacking, not because you forget, but because you know exactly what's in them, and it's easier to pretend you don't. I was looking for something, though I wasn't sure what. Just that after sending that message to Mom, after dredging up the memory of Dad's voice and the weight of his last warning, I felt an itch under my skin that wouldn't let me sit still. A feeling that somewhere among my own discarded artifacts, there might be proof, not just emotional proof, not just the ache in my gut, but something physical, something real, something with ink and dates and letters that would validate what I knew to be true. And that's when I found the envelope. It was tucked inside a manila folder labeled Lena, grade 8, though I never remembered labeling anything so formally, and inside was a stack of photocopies. Emails between my mother and my teachers, notes scribbled in the margins, things like, "She seems bright but emotionally erratic," and "We're concerned about her tendency to isolate herself during group activities." What stood out, though, wasn't the content itself, but the tone. My mother's replies were dripping with sympathy, with a performative sorrow that made her seem like a martyr. We've tried everything at home. We just want her to feel loved. Except none of it was real. I remembered those nights at home. There were no talks, no warmth, just cold dinners and colder silences. Moments where she'd look through me like I was furniture she was considering replacing. I remembered one evening in particular. I had gotten a B- on a history quiz, and instead of asking what happened, she asked if I was even capable of focusing on anything that mattered. And when I tried to explain, she sighed and said, "You always have an excuse. Your sister just gets things done." I carried that sentence into adulthood like a splinter under my skin. I took pictures of the documents with my phone, not because I planned on using them, but because I needed to know they existed in the digital world now, that they couldn't just disappear the way my memories had so often been dismissed or rewritten. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Melanie. "You're scaring her. She's not eating. She just sits in the living room holding Dad's photo and saying she failed us." For a moment, I felt a flicker of something, guilt maybe, or sorrow, but it passed quickly, replaced by the memory of that same woman standing at my bedroom door in my junior year of high school, asking why I was crying over a breakup, when, in her words, "It's not like he was going to marry you. You push people away. You always have." She had said that with such casual cruelty that I hadn't even responded. I had just turned over, faced the wall, and decided then and there that I'd never bring another sadness to her door again. And I didn't. So I stared at Melanie's message, and I typed back. "She's finally feeling what I felt for 30 years. Don't call it fear. Call it recognition." No reply this time. Instead, I spent the rest of the evening doing something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. I went up into the attic of my building, not the creepy crawl space kind, but the shared one with storage units where dust and memories settle together. I had a key to the unit Dad helped me rent when I moved in, a small padlocked space where I'd thrown old photo albums, furniture from college, and boxes of papers he gave me when he cleaned out his office after retiring. I flipped through them without any real expectation. But then I saw the edge of a leather-bound journal tucked between a stack of receipts and envelopes. Dad's handwriting, his daily notes. Most entries were dull, meetings, errands, reminders to check the water heater. But the final entry before his last hospital admission was short. "Talk to Lena. She's not broken, just tired of being reshaped." I should have done more. I see it now. I sat there for what felt like hours, rereading that one paragraph until it blurred, until the truth wrapped itself around me like armor, not comfort, until I finally stood up and realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not the kind of anger that wants to destroy, but the kind that sharpens. Because now I knew that everything I remembered had a second witness, and Mom wouldn't be able to pretend otherwise forever. It's strange how some words never lose their sharpness. How even after years of weathering and repetition and internal arguments trying to dull them down to something manageable, something neutral, they still arrive in your memory with the same velocity, the same precision, the same terrible certainty. And when I thought about what my father had whispered to me in the hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and regret, I realized those few words had more gravity than entire decades of my mother's carefully composed narratives. Because they weren't just about her. They were about survival, about truth, and about what it takes to resist becoming a version of yourself someone else wrote without your permission. That morning, after I reread Dad's journal entry for the 5th time, his handwriting shaky, slanted slightly to the right, the kind of script that only men born before the 60s seemed to have, I knew that sending the message to my mother wasn't just about confrontation. It was about reclaiming something. I had spent most of my life ducking under her perception of me, trying to either fix it or ignore it, hoping that if I was quiet or successful or polite enough, it would dissolve on its own. But of course it never did, because people like her don't operate on evidence. They operate on instinct, and my mother's instinct was always to diminish what she didn't understand. Do you remember what Dad told me the week he died? That was all I wrote. And I knew it would hit her like a slow-growing poison, not because she remembered the conversation, but because she wouldn't. And that uncertainty, that question hanging in the air, was more destabilizing than any accusation I could have made. My mother thrives on control, on knowing exactly where everyone stands in her emotional chessboard, and for once, I had moved a piece she didn't see coming. I didn't expect a response right away, or maybe ever. But what I did get instead was another message from Melanie, this time a voice memo that came through with the title, "Just Listen." And for a moment I hesitated, thumb hovering above the play button like it might explode, because there was a very real part of me that didn't want to hear my sister's voice say what I already suspected. Not because it would hurt, but because it might confirm, in irreversible terms, that something fundamental in our family had already cracked and there would be no putting it back together. I pressed play. Melanie's voice was trembling, not dramatic, not the kind of staged crying you sometimes hear when people want to sound like they're suffering, but the genuine, breathless kind that only comes when you're watching a person you've trusted your whole life unravel in front of you. She keeps saying she doesn't remember, but then she starts crying and asking if it's true. She said, "Did I really say that to her? Did I really make her feel like that?" And I don't know what to say, Lena, because I'm starting to think she did. And maybe worse. And she's not eating. She's just sitting there, holding that damn photo album, muttering things like, "I was trying to protect her." And then 5 minutes later, she says, "She always hated me." And I can't get through to her. I sat there motionless, letting the silence after the message linger longer than necessary. Part of me wanted to feel something cathartic, some kind of justice, some small moment of triumph. But what I felt instead was this strange hollow ache, like someone had scooped out the center of me and left only the outline, the shape of a daughter who used to want her mother to understand her so badly it hurt. But now that the moment had finally come, now that the cracks were showing, it didn't feel like justice. It felt like aftermath. There are so many things you want from an apology that you'll never get. The right words, the right timing, the right balance between sorrow and responsibility. And in the absence of those things, all you're left with is a pile of emotional debris and the question of whether or not you're supposed to rebuild something from it, or just walk away and let the weeds take over. I didn't respond to Melanie right away. I needed air, I needed distance, I needed something real, so I walked. Through my neighborhood, past the cafe I used to love, but stopped going to after a barista once said, "You look just like your mom." And I smiled politely while my stomach turned. Past the little bookstore where I used to browse self-help books and then tuck them behind the cookbooks because I was too embarrassed to buy them. Past the school where, for a few months, I tried to volunteer with kids but left early every time. Because I couldn't stand the way little girls looked at their mothers with such trust, such uncomplicated devotion. By the time I got back home, there was another message waiting. This time it was from Mom. It wasn't long, just a voicemail, just breathing, heavy, deliberate, like she was about to speak and then stopped herself over and over again, like the words were crowding her throat but couldn't quite make it out. And then at the very end, almost too soft to hear, she said, "You win." And that was it. I played it twice, not because I needed confirmation, but because I needed to understand what kind of victory this was supposed to be. Was it surrender? Was it an accusation? Was it grief? Because if I had won, then what had I actually taken? It wasn't peace. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't closure. Not the real kind, anyway. It was something else. Something darker. Something lonelier. I poured another glass of wine, walked to the mirror, and stared at myself, until the reflections stopped looking like me and started looking like a composite of every version my mother had ever claimed I was. Angry, cold, difficult. And I whispered, just to break the silence, "No, Mom, I didn't win." And for the first time, I believed it. Because this wasn't a victory. This was a reckoning, and we were only just getting started. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a childhood home after a storm has passed. Not the kind of storm that leaves branches on the lawn or cracks in the foundation, but the quieter, more insidious kind that passes through conversations, reshapes memories, and leaves behind the unmistakable weight of truth that can't be unspoken or undone, no matter how many years have passed or how many times the windows have been washed to make it all look clean again. When I pulled into the driveway of my mother's house, the house I had once roller skated through in socks, the house I had watched seasons change through a window that used to rattle in the wind, the house where every room held at least one memory I'd rather not revisit, it looked exactly as it always had. The front porch light was on, even though it was still broad daylight, and the lawn had been recently mowed by someone who wasn't her, which told me Melanie had either taken it upon herself to maintain the appearance of normalcy, or maybe Mom had finally started paying the neighbor's teenage son to do it, the way she used to threaten she would if we didn't start pulling our weight. I sat in the car for several minutes longer than I needed to, staring at the front door as though expecting it to open on its own, half hoping this was all some elaborate misunderstanding that could be cleared with a few deep breaths and a pot of oversteeped tea, even though I knew, down to the marrow of my bones, that what waited for me inside wasn't conversation, but consequence. I had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed, and while I didn't regret any of it, I also understood that certain truths, once named aloud or implied with enough force, become living things. They breathe, they rattle the pipes, they sit in the corners of rooms and watch everyone try to pretend they aren't there. I didn't knock. I had my old key, the one with the chipped blue plastic cap that still smelled faintly of old leather from the bag I used to carry everywhere in college, the one Mom once said made me look like I was trying too hard to be taken seriously. I slid it into the lock, and it turned without resistance. Inside, the air felt heavier than it should have. Not stale exactly, but dense in that way houses get when people have been sitting still too long. Like the air has absorbed too many unsaid things and doesn't know where to put them anymore. The kitchen was empty. The counters were clean. A single slice of pie sat untouched under plastic wrap, like a prop in a play that had been canceled after opening night. There were 2 coffee cups in the sink, both rinsed but not scrubbed, and beside them, a folded napkin with my name written on it in handwriting that hadn't changed since grade school, sharp, efficient, a little too forceful, as if pressing harder made the words more truthful. I didn't see her right away, and part of me worried that maybe I was too late, not for forgiveness or confrontation, but for something else, something smaller and more human, like the chance to witness the moment she finally became real to me. But then I heard the chair creak in the living room, the same chair my father used to sit in when the evenings grew long and the house felt too quiet, the one he never let anyone else use, even though he never said so aloud. And when I turned the corner, I saw it. It was empty. But on the armrest, carefully placed with the same precision she used to reserve for holiday place settings and photo albums, was an envelope. My name again. Inside, no long letter, no grand gesture, just a note scribbled on the back of a church program from 3 weeks ago. Your father's chair is yours now. Use it well. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no last attempt to regain the upper hand. Just a sentence that felt like both an invitation and a surrender. I sat down in it slowly, the cushion still bearing the faint outline of his shoulders, and for the first time in what felt like years, I let myself relax. Not fully, not deeply, but just enough to allow the chair to hold my weight without bracing myself for impact. The room was still. The television remote was on the floor. A photo album lay open on the coffee table to a page where Melanie and I were dressed in matching jumpers, smiling the way children do when they've been promised ice cream if they cooperate. And then I saw it. Another box. This one tucked under the coffee table, a little dusty but clearly not forgotten. I pulled it out carefully, afraid of what I might find, and inside were letters, dozens of them, some sealed, some not, some with my name on them, others with no name at all. I opened the first one. You were a difficult child, not because of who you were, but because of what you reminded me of. I saw parts of myself in you, the parts I spent my whole life trying to kill off, and I hated you for surviving them. I read that line 3 times before folding the letter back up and placing it beside me on the table. I didn't cry. I didn't break. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt seen, finally, brutally, without the pageantry. Letter after letter painted a portrait not of a monster, but of a woman so consumed by fear, by the ghosts of her own mother's cruelty, by the pressure to control what she could not understand, that she built a daughter in her mind who never quite matched the one in front of her, and instead of adjusting her view, she simply insisted harder. There was no great climax, no final confrontation, just this quiet unraveling. And when I stood up, hours later, the sun already slipping below the rooftops outside, I didn't take the box, as I didn't carry anything with me except the feeling that something had shifted, not fixed, not healed, but dislodged just enough to breathe again. I walked to the door, one hand on the knob, and turned back to look at the chair one last time. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't say anything. Some stories don't end with closure. Some just end with someone finally standing up and walking away.